All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely. Always ready to dig in.
Okay, good. So today, we're going to Kentucky.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this case has been making headlines, and it's got some seriously disturbing details.
Yeah, I read that true crime news article. It really got to me.
Me too. It's the kind of story that sticks with you, you know?
Absolutely. Like on a gut level.
Right. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. Not just report on the crime itself, which is awful enough.
Yeah. The murder of Norma Greenwell, 81 years old, in her own home.
Right, in Ohio County. But we want to go deeper, you know, figure out why this story is so disturbing, what it might tell us about vulnerability, especially in small towns, and how it all ties into the justice system.
It's like it hits on this fear we all have, right?
Totally.
Being attacked in your own home.
The place where you should feel safest.
Exactly. And when you add in the age of the victim, the brutality.
Oh, yeah. It just amplifies everything, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. It just amplifies everything, doesn't it?
Right, Tam. It makes you think about your own family, your own parents, grandparents, even yourself as you get older.
And that's where it gets really personal, right? Like, how do we protect the most vulnerable among us?
Especially in areas where maybe resources are stretched thin.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we go any further, let's lay out the basics of this case for everyone. February 5th, this year, Norma Greenwell was found murdered in her home in Ohio County. Her neighbor, 23-year-old Aaron Crow Jr., was indicted on multiple charges, including murder and burglary.
Wow.
Yeah. Authorities believe the murder weapon was a machete, which they recovered from a nearby pond.
Machete?
A machete.
Oh, my gosh. And I remember reading that a canine unit led them right to that pond.
Yeah, that detail stuck with me, too. It's like...
It paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. This quiet community, this horrific crime, and then the dog finding this hidden piece of evidence.
It's chilling.
It really is. And the sheriff, Adam Wright, he didn't hold back. Called it an act of pure evil.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty strong words, right?
It definitely shows you the impact. I mean, to use language like that.
Absolutely. Right now, Crow is being held on $1 million bond.
$1 million.
Mm-hmm. But here's where it gets even more complex. Crow has a prior criminal history, including a robbery charge back in 2020.
Oh, wow. So this isn't his first run-in with the law.
Nope. And investigators think he might not have acted alone in this case. They believe at least one more person could be involved.
So there's still a lot to uncover.
A lot to uncover. So, you know, we have this brutal crime, a young man with a troubled past, a community left to deal with the fear and uncertainty.
Yeah.
What jumps out at you as we dig into these initial details?
For me, it's the age difference between Greenwell and Crow that really stands out. 81 years old versus 23.
It's a huge gap.
It is. And it highlights how vulnerable elderly people can be, especially if they're isolated or maybe don't have a strong support system.
And the brutality of the crime itself, the sheriff calling it pure evil. I'm curious, does that kind of language actually help us understand what happened?
That's a great question. I mean, it's certainly dramatic.
Yeah.
But from a, criminology perspective, terms like evil don't really explain the why. We have to remember, even the most horrific crimes have a context. A series of events, decisions that lead up to them.
So it's more about expressing horror than offering any real insight.
I think so, yeah. And it makes you wonder what impact a crime like this has on a community like Ohio County. Think about all the elderly residents there. Their sense of safety is just shattered.
Right, like suddenly, who do you trust?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Crow himself for a minute.
Okay.
He's young, he's got this prior record, but does that automatically mean he was capable of murder?
Right.
I mean, robbery is serious, but it's not the same as taking a life.
It's tricky because it's tempting to connect the dots, right? Past behavior, present actions, but it's rarely that simple.
So we can't just assume that because someone committed a robbery 5 years ago, they're now capable of this level of violence.
Exactly. We need to look at each situation individually, the specifics of each case. There are so many factors at play.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we unpack the rest of this story, going beyond the headlines, beyond the easy assumptions, and trying to understand everything that might have contributed to this awful situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
It is. And we're going to do just that right after we take a quick break. All right, we're back. And we're still trying to wrap our heads around this Kentucky case. You know, one thing we haven't really talked about yet is motive.
Yeah, the big why.
What could possibly lead someone to do something like this? Especially to an elderly neighbor.
It's the question everyone's asking, right? And honestly, we may never have a clear-cut answer,
Yeah, that's true.
but we can look at what usually comes up in these types of situations. Robbery is often a big factor.
Makes sense, especially with the age difference, right?
Right. Younger perpetrator, older, maybe more vulnerable victim.
But wouldn't there be signs of a robbery? Like stuff missing from the house?
You'd think so.
Unless it was staged or something.
You're thinking like a detective already.
Well, it's hard not to. But those are good points. It's something investigators will definitely be looking into.
For sure. But sometimes a robbery isn't this planned out thing. It could be more about opportunity.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Maybe Crow saw a chance, went in impulsively, and things just spiraled from there.
So it could have been a crime of opportunity gone horribly wrong.
Sadly, yeah. And that's scary to think about.
It really is. It makes you realize how important safety and security are, especially for older folks living alone.
Absolutely. They can be easy targets, which is why we all need to be more aware, more vigilant.
Look out for each other, right?
Exactly. Being proactive about protecting those who are vulnerable.
Okay, so speaking of being proactive, let's talk about Crow's past for a second.
Okay.
We know about that robbery charge from back in 2020. And this is something I think a lot of people struggle with, right? Like, as a society, how do we balance individual rights with keeping the community safe, especially when someone has a criminal record?
It's a constant balancing act, that's for sure.
It feels like we're always walking this tightrope.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Because on one hand, we believe in rehabilitation.
Second chances.
Exactly. People can change, they can learn from their mistakes.
But at the same time, we have to make sure everyone's safe.
Yeah.
Everyone in the community.
You got it.
So how do we even find that balance? Where's the line?
It's tough. There's no easy answer. It has to be a nuanced approach, looking at everything, the type of crime that happened before, the person's circumstances, how much risks they pose to others.
It's a lot to consider.
It is. And we can't forget that even with all the tools we have to assess risk, we can't predict the future perfectly.
People are unpredictable.
Exactly. Human behavior is complex. There's always going to be some level of uncertainty.
Which brings us back to this case, right?
Yeah.
We have Crow, young guy, prior record, but that doesn't automatically equal guilt in this crime.
No, it doesn't. We have to remember the presumption of innocence until proven otherwise.
Let the evidence speak, not jump to conclusions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And while all that's happening, let's focus on what we can control.
Right.
Look out for our neighbors, support victims of crime, push for policies that keep people safe while also respecting individual rights.
Okay, so we've talked about the suspect, about the justice system, but let's circle back to Norma Greenwell for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
She was more than just a name in a news story, right? She was someone's mother, grandmother, friend, part of this community.
You're right, and it's so important to remember that.
What can we learn from what happened to her, from this tragic loss?
I think her story really highlights how vulnerable we can all be. It's a wake-up call. Bad things can happen anywhere, even in places that seem safe and peaceful.
And it makes you think about how to better protect those who are most at risk. You know, this whole thing happening in a small town, it really struck me.
Why is that?
Well, we tend to think of violent crime as a big city problem.
Yeah, that's a common perception.
But this shows it can happen anywhere, to anyone.
Absolutely. And for people in small towns, that can be especially unsettling.
Yeah, because there's that sense of community that it can't happen here feeling.
Right, but crime doesn't care about geography. It doesn't discriminate.
So what can we do? How do we make our communities safer, especially for folks who are more vulnerable?
It's complicated, but I think it starts with awareness. Knowing the risks, being aware of what's going on around you, both in your own neighborhood and in the wider world.
Recognizing the factors that contribute to crime in the first place.
Yes, things like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, we can't ignore those.
But awareness alone isn't enough, is it?
You're right. We have to take action. And that can look like so many different things. Checking on your elderly neighbors, being aware of your surroundings, reporting anything that seems suspicious.
Even small things can make a difference.
Exactly. And then there's the bigger picture stuff. Supporting community programs, pushing for policies that address the root causes of crime, working toward a more just and fair society for everyone.
I love that you brought up justice and fairness.
That's crucial.
Because that's what we all want, right? A world where everyone feels safe and supported, no matter their age, background, or circumstances.
Couldn't agree more.
We've covered a lot today, haven't we? This horrific crime, the justice system, individual rights versus community safety, looking out for one another.
Yeah, it's been a lot, but it's important to talk about these things.
It is. And before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We talked about the responsibility of looking after our older neighbors.
Right.
But this case, it goes beyond that, right? It's about looking out for everyone in our communities. We're all connected. What happens to one person affects us all. So let's be kind, be compassionate, be supportive, create a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and connected.
Couldn't have put it better myself. That's a perfect note to end on.
Well said. And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. As always, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We've talked a lot about safety and vulnerability in the justice system, but as we wrap up this deep dive into this Kentucky case, I feel like there's something else we need to consider.
Yeah, I think so too.
What is it?
Well, there's this tendency to rush to judgment, especially with a case this shocking.
Yeah, that's natural, I guess.
It is, but what if we try to step back from all the outrage and ask, what led Aaron Crow Jr. to this point?
You're talking about trying to understand him, even after what he's accused of doing.
Exactly. And it's not about condoning his actions at all, but if we truly want to learn from this and prevent future tragedies, maybe we need to look at the human story behind the headlines.
That's a really tough thing for a lot of people to do, I think.
Oh, for sure.
You hear about a crime this brutal, especially against someone older, defenseless, it's hard not to feel angry, disgusted.
I get
You want justice, maybe even revenge.
those are all natural reactions, definitely.
But how do we get to that place of empathy?
Well, imagine you're in a small town, right? Maybe you know people who've struggled with addiction, poverty, haven't had many opportunities.
Yeah.
Maybe you've even seen how those things can sometimes lead to crime.
So you're saying there's this bigger picture we need to think about.
Yeah, the societal context, we can't just focus on the crime itself. We have to look at what creates the conditions for these tragedies to happen.
Like, what were Crow's experiences? What support did he have? Did the system fail him somehow?
Those are all questions investigators might be asking, but they're questions we should be asking ourselves too, as a community, as a society.
Are we doing enough to prevent these things from happening in the first place? Are there enough opportunities for young people, especially those at risk?
That's what it comes down to. We can't just react after a crime happens. We have to be proactive, investing our communities in education, social programs, mental health resources.
So you're asking us to rethink how we view crime and punishment. Look beyond the individual and see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And to remember that everyone has a story, even someone accused of something terrible. Trying to understand that story doesn't excuse the behavior, but it might give us some insights that could help us prevent similar situations in the future.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. We've talked about so much in this deep dive: vulnerability, community safety, the justice system. But I think that idea of empathy, that's what we need to hold on to.
Yeah.
It's not weakness, it's a strength. It helps us see each other, even when it's hard, and it can lead us toward building a more just and compassionate world.
Absolutely. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. Take what you've learned, share it with others, and keep talking about these important issues.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.